In the summer of 1944, the German High Command still believed that America was a nation of soft soldiers and careless planners. To them, the United States was a country of factories and farmers, not warriors. They laughed at American logistics, the endless trucks, the convoys, the obsession with supply lines. To German generals raised on the discipline of the Wehrmacht, this obsession looked like weakness. Real soldiers, they thought, lived off the land. They didn't need mountains of gasoline, spare parts, or food to keep moving. But soon, they would learn how wrong they were. When the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord opened the door to the liberation of France. The beaches were won, and the front lines moved inland. By August, the Germans were in full retreat, but with victory came a new kind of danger, one that no bullet could stop: exhaustion of supplies. The Allied advance was so fast that logistics couldn't keep up. The ports of France were still under German control, and the only reliable supply route was back at the beaches of Normandy. Every bullet, every ration, every drop of fuel had to be trucked hundreds of miles across the devastated French countryside. As General George S. Patton's Third Army surged forward in a relentless drive across France, it devoured fuel at a staggering rate. His tanks and trucks needed over 400,000 gallons of gasoline a day. But the lines of supply were stretched thin, and the depots were running dry. By late August, Patton's tanks were grinding to a halt, not because of German resistance, but because they had no fuel left. Soldiers joked bitterly that gasoline is as precious as blood. At Supreme Headquarters, General Eisenhower faced an impossible problem. Two great armies, the British under Montgomery and the Americans under Patton, both racing toward Germany, both desperate for fuel. There simply wasn't enough to go around. Something had to be done. Fast. So the Americans did what they always did best: build. The U.S. Army created an emergency transportation network unlike anything seen before. They called it the Red Ball Express. The name came from an old railroad term meaning Priority Express, and this was exactly that: an all-out effort to feed the front line with the supplies it needed to keep fighting. From August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express began rolling. Day and night, without rest, thousands of trucks thundered down a special one-way route from Normandy to the forward depots near the front lines. Each truck carried food, ammunition, medical supplies, and most importantly, gasoline. The system was a marvel of organization. Roads were marked with red circles, signs pointed the way, and military police kept the convoys moving. Trucks leaving Normandy carried supplies east. Empty trucks returning west had to use a different road to avoid traffic jams. It was a continuous loop, an artery of war pumping life into Patton's advance. The drivers were mostly African-American soldiers serving in segregated units. Though the U.S. Army still practiced discrimination, these men became the unsung heroes of the Allied victory. They worked under a constant danger: German air attacks, long nights, and bad roads, but they kept driving. They called it the most important job in the world. At its peak, the Red Ball Express operated nearly 6,000 trucks and moved over 12,000 tons of supplies every single day. The drivers called themselves the lifeline of the front. Without them, Patton's tanks would have stopped, and the war might have dragged on for months longer. But behind the scenes, chaos was never far away. Convoys broke down. Engines overheated. Tires blew out. Some drivers barely slept for days, running on coffee and adrenaline. The roads were so rough that some trucks lost half their cargo along the way. Still, they pushed forward. As one driver later said, "If we stopped, Patton stopped." And Patton never stopped. Meanwhile, German intelligence was stunned. They had assumed that the Allied advance would slow naturally once supplies ran low. But the Americans had turned logistics into a weapon. For the first time in history, an army was advancing not just with soldiers, but with an industrial machine behind it. To the Germans, it was unthinkable. Their supply system still relied on horse-drawn wagons for nearly 70% of its transport. Their tanks and trucks ran out of fuel regularly, and now they were facing an enemy that could move 500,000 men and machines across an entire continent, just by sheer organization. As the Red Ball Express thundered through the French countryside, its roar became a symbol of American might. Villagers lined the roads to watch the endless stream of trucks go by. Dust rose like fog. Engines screamed through the night. Soldiers said you could hear the convoys long before you saw them, a sound that meant victory was coming. And still, Patton wanted more. "Keep 'em rolling," he said. "Don't let my tanks stop. I'll drive them straight into Germany." By September, the Red Ball Express had delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies. But the faster the Americans advanced, the farther they got from their base. Fuel consumption doubled. Trucks wore out. Drivers collapsed from exhaustion, and the German resistance stiffened as they retreated toward their homeland. It became a race between fuel and distance, and no one knew which would win. But for the moment, the Red Ball Express kept rolling, its soldiers driving through hell to keep an army alive. Historians later noted how these experiences influenced the formation of West Germany's post-war identity. The POW's exposure to America's industrial and political system helped plant the early seeds of the Democratic Federal Republic that emerged in the late 1940s. They had seen firsthand the link between freedom and prosperity, between innovation and trust. For the Americans, the experiment of housing enemy soldiers on home soil was an extraordinary success. Despite initial fears, there were few escapes and even fewer violent incidents. The humane treatment of the prisoners earned international respect and set a standard for how nations could uphold their values even in victory. It also helped reconcile two peoples once locked in bitter combat. Decades later, some of those German POWs returned to visit the very camps where they had once been held. They found that the fences were gone, the guard towers dismantled, replaced by farms or schools. One former prisoner, standing on the site of his old camp in Texas, told a reporter, "I came here as an enemy, but I left as a friend of America." Their memories paint a vivid picture of shock, transformation, and understanding. They remembered the smell of freshly baked bread in the camp kitchens, the sound of American music on the radio, and the sight of vast trains thundering across the plains. They remembered the kindness of strangers who treated them not as monsters, but as men. Perhaps the most lasting impression was not of the machines, but of the spirit behind them. America's industrial might was visible everywhere, in the roaring factories, the endless highways, the ocean of vehicles and planes. But to the German POWs, it represented something greater, a civilization built on trust, equality, and the idea that power should serve the people, not enslave them. In the years after the war, as West Germany rose from the ashes, many of those former prisoners carried a hidden lesson within them. They had seen what a nation could achieve when it combined technology with freedom and power with compassion. The factories of America had shown them that the real strength of a country was not in its weapons, but in the dignity it gave its people. And so, from the dust of defeat and the silence of the camps, a generation of Germans returned home, changed. They had arrived in America as soldiers of a fallen empire. They left as witnesses to a different kind of greatness, one forged not by conquest, but by creation. When historians look back on World War II, they often speak of battles and strategies, of generals and tanks. But hidden in that history is another story, the story of men who crossed an ocean as prisoners and discovered the true meaning of freedom in the very heart of their enemy's land. This was the quiet legacy of the German POWs in America, a story not of humiliation, but of awakening. A story that reminds us that even in war, the greatest victory is not over an army, but over ignorance. And that sometimes, the most powerful weapon a nation can wield is the strength of its ideals.